Everybody has a story, and if you make it a habit of coming in late at night, you better have one. Fiction or true, everyone can tell a story about their experiences in life, their family, their job, or maybe they can just tell a good joke. These stories seem to span childhood, teen years, young adulthood, working adult, marriage, or maybe even retirement. For me, my stories seem to address 6 areas: childhood, teen years, my job, my relationships or marriage, raising kids, and in my case as an educator, disciplining kids. When I have conversations with my children or others, they all seem to fall into one of the 6 categories mentioned. They seem to start with, "When I was a kid," or 40 years ago. This is my way of trying to wrap my head around the present as I compare it to the past. Well, that's a nice try. These monologues, as I call them, are all stories that I've told over 40 years in education, as a college instructor and as a professional developer. I see them as instructive, but they'll probably engage and entertain you as well. Maybe someone will be inspired by my wit or find ways to communicate their experiences that will help solve a current problem. The 6 categories never have any order. They get told based upon my audience and at times when I see a need to communicate an engaging illustration or something like that. I let the audience decide what category each story falls into, and that's a good thing. As a child and a teenager, my life was spent living over a bar, and I don't think anyone could be impacted more by their parents and the work that they did than I was. My parents were tavern owners in a small town in central New Jersey called Carteret. I didn't understand how popular they were or of the iconic nature of Burns's Tavern until I was much older and I spoke to people who remembered the place, which is now no longer. My dad was Albert, or Al, and those that were close to him called him Ab. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall, bald, had blue eyes, and was on the surface a good-looking man. If you lived with him and you looked close, you would easily be able to recognize his nose that was crooked, his sagging left shoulder from a broken collarbone that he suffered when he was a teenager, and a large scar on his ear that was a result of one of his elementary school teachers slamming his head into a desk because of his horseplay. He was impeccably dressed. Shoes shined, shirt starched, pants creased, and his ties were always beautifully noted with a diamond tie tack that was always sitting perfectly in the middle of his tie. Albert was a World War II veteran and bore the emotional and physical scars that come with war. He was drafted in 1942 and at the age of 34, which by today's standards is rather old to be fighting a war. He spent 4 years in the Pacific and in New Guinea and in the Philippines and Australia as well. He was a mess sergeant, preparing food for large numbers of soldiers every day. He came home in 1946 with malaria and tuberculosis, and I was born 9 years later after his return. And as I got older, I always remember him being very slight, almost sickly, but very health and diet conscious. Oh, don't get me wrong. He may have watched his diet, but that didn't stop him from smoking a pack of Luckies a day and at times going off on a bender and boozing it up a few times a year. When he was drafted, my mother was pregnant, and Burns's Tavern was already established in an area called the Chrome section of Carteret. This was on a street called Hudson Street. My mother, Helen, who ran the tavern, was my dad, while my dad was in the service, was much younger than my dad. She was 21 when she married him, and he was 33. She was 4 feet 10 inches tall, but she was one of the toughest women I ever met. She was a perfect barmaid and could handle all the rough and tumble problems associated with the tavern business. She had no trouble speaking her mind and telling customers to shut up and refusing service to anyone that she believed had enough to drink. She also had no trouble engaging in battles with my dad when arguments broke out between them. And I remember as a boy, I always was so thrilled with my mother's appearance. She was pretty. She had a great shape, nice legs, olive-colored skin that never seemed to wrinkle. The men in the bar liked her also, probably a little too much for my dad's liking. When she was alone in the bar, he would usually call downstairs to see who was there, or he'd ask me who the customers were. She was probably responsible for much of the business based upon her looks alone. Albert and Helen forged a life together as the owners of Burns Tavern. And I often wondered as I grew older if they were business partners or a husband and wife. They were around each other so much, and at times they seemed to just not get along. And as a little boy, all I wanted was for them to get along, but often they didn't. I found solace in the tavern, and in the customers, and in the lifestyle. I loved the customers. They became my friends. I spent hours talking to them as a young boy and tended bar there when I became 18 years old. I was still in high school. I loved it. Most kids had their father. I felt like every customer that graced the doorway of my parents' bar was another father that I could talk to. I came to realize how the people and events in that tavern shaped my life when my daughters Sarah and Grace were very young. I used to tell them stories about my childhood. My kids loved the stories of the craziness, but most of all, what I learned during my 23 years at Burns' Tavern. The tavern was sold in 1977 simply because my parents couldn't do it anymore. Shortly after it was sold, my dad had a massive stroke and passed away. He always wanted me to receive a college degree, and sadly he wasn't there when I received my diploma. Interestingly enough, when my father bought his first liquor license, it cost him $2 in 1942. The license was sold in 1977 for $25,000, which is a bargain, even by today's standards. My mom went off to live with my sister and her husband and lived there until she passed away in 2004 at the age of 84. My brother-in-law, Hank, who was an icon in the town of Carteret himself, was given the job of demolishing all the old buildings to make room for new housing and businesses. Burns' Tavern, which had been vacant for about 10 years, was merely a structure at this point and needed to come down. Water damage, time, and weather ravaged the place that I called home for many years. I couldn't even get a last look at the inside of the building before the demolition because it was just too unsafe. I had hoped to get a piece of the knotty pine wood that was part of the upstairs apartment where I lived as a remembrance of my past. You know, I really didn't need the wood to remember any events at all that occurred there and in the tavern and the people that I met. Everything was just unforgettable. Where, how, and when I grew up impacted every area of my life. It made me a storyteller, and it helped me in my craft as an educator. Everybody truly has a story, and I can only hope that the stories that I tell will teach, engage, and inspire you. If you would like to book an instructive storytelling session for your school or organization, or maybe a retreat, just follow the link at the end of this video.